The spring of 1984 arrived quietly across western Tennessee. The fields surrounding the small rural town were turning green again. Church bells echoed through the back roads every Sunday morning, and families were preparing for Easter weekend the same way they always had. Children rode bicycles through gravel roads. Farmers parked dusty trucks outside old diners. Neighbors still left their doors unlocked. It was the kind of town where everybody knew everybody, and everybody knew the Brown triplets. 15-year-old John Brown, Kristina Ybarra, and Carrie Reyes were impossible to miss together. Even though they were triplets, the three siblings looked and acted completely different. John was tall, quiet, and protective. People often said he behaved more like a grown man than a teenager. Kristina was loud, funny, and fearless. She could walk into any room and make people laugh within seconds. Carrie was softer, more reserved. She loved drawing pictures in old notebooks and spent most afternoons sitting beside her grandfather on the porch, listening to music drifting from nearby radio stations. But no matter how different they were, one thing never changed. They were always together. Teachers remembered them sitting side by side during lunch. Store owners remembered seeing all three walking home together after school. Even late at night, if someone saw one of the siblings somewhere in town, the other two were usually close behind. Their mother, Denise Reyes, worked double shifts at a small diner near the highway to support the family. Money was always tight. Some weeks the electricity barely stayed on, but neighbors later said the house was still full of laughter. The children were loved deeply. Most evenings, their grandfather, Walter Brown, helped raise them while Denise worked late hours. Walter was a quiet Vietnam veteran who rarely spoke about himself, but everybody in town respected him. He treated the triplets like his entire world, especially after their father disappeared years earlier. As Easter weekend approached, the church at the center of town began preparing for its annual spring celebration. Volunteers decorated folding tables with colored ribbons while children practiced choir songs inside the hall. On Friday afternoon, the triplets arrived early to help. Several people later remembered Kristina climbing onto a chair, trying to hang paper decorations across the wall, while John complained she was going to fall. Carrie sat nearby drawing flowers on handmade Easter signs. For hours, the siblings laughed together inside the church hall while old gospel music played softly through dusty speakers. At one point, a local neighbor named Martha Simmons carried a small camcorder outside to record the preparations. The footage was shaky and slightly blurred, but investigators would later study it for years. The video showed the triplets standing beside an old pickup truck outside the church just before sunset. Kristina was laughing at something off camera. Carrie covered her face shyly, and John stood behind his sisters with his hands in his jacket pockets, smiling quietly. Nobody watching the footage realized they were looking at the last known recording of the three siblings alive together. That evening, the town became crowded with people heading toward a small roadside Easter fair set up near the highway outside town. Families gathered around food stands while children played games beneath temporary carnival lights. Shortly after 7 p.m., the triplets left the church and started walking toward the fair together. Walter later told investigators he offered to drive them, but Kristina insisted they wanted to walk like everybody else. It was less than 2 miles away. The road leading there cut past an abandoned gas station and several empty fields before reaching the fairgrounds near Highway 14. At first, nothing seemed unusual. A local mechanic later told police he saw the siblings walking beside the road just after sunset. Another witness remembered Kristina waving at passing cars while Carrie carried a folded church flyer in her hands. Then, somewhere between the church and the fairgrounds, the triplets vanished. They never arrived at the Easter fair. At first, nobody panicked. Walter assumed the children had stayed longer with friends after the celebration. Denise was still working late at the diner and believed the triplets were safely home. But by 10 p.m., the house was still empty. By midnight, fear began settling into the family. Walter drove the back roads himself searching for them. He checked the fairgrounds twice. He walked through nearby fields carrying a flashlight while calling their names into the darkness. No answer ever came back. By early morning, the sheriff's office officially opened a missing persons investigation. The news spread quickly across town. Neighbors joined the search before sunrise. Farmers searched old barns. Teenagers rode dirt bikes through nearby trails. Church volunteers organized groups to comb the wooded areas near the highway, but there was still no sign of the siblings. Then investigators discovered something strange. Several witnesses remembered seeing the triplets near the abandoned gas station shortly after sunset. But nobody could agree on what happened afterward. One person claimed the siblings got inside a dark-colored car. Another swore they kept walking toward the fair. A truck driver later reported seeing 3 teenagers arguing with someone near the roadside ditch outside town. But his timeline didn't match the others. Detectives immediately realized something important. Somewhere along that lonely stretch of highway, something had interrupted the siblings before they ever reached the fairgrounds. Hours later, just before dawn, Deputy Harold Gaines spotted something partially buried near a muddy drainage ditch several miles outside town. It was a denim jacket. The jacket belonged to John Brown. The sleeves were soaked from muddy water. Dirt covered parts of the fabric. But investigators noticed something deeply unsettling almost immediately. There was no blood, no tearing, no signs of a fight. It looked less like evidence left behind during an attack and more like something intentionally abandoned. Walter arrived at the scene minutes later. The moment he recognized the jacket, witnesses said the old man completely collapsed emotionally. Deputies had to physically hold him upright while investigators searched the ditch nearby, but the rest of the area was empty. No footprints, no bicycles, no bodies, nothing. As the Tennessee sun slowly rose over the fields that morning, detectives carefully searched the jacket for clues. At first, they found almost nothing unusual. Then one investigator noticed stitching along the inside lining had been opened recently. Hidden beneath the fabric was a small folded piece of paper, and written on it was a phone number nobody in the family recognized. By the second morning, the disappearance of the Brown triplets had already become the biggest story Western Tennessee had seen in years. Police cars crowded the roads outside town. Search teams moved through muddy farmland carrying long sticks and flashlights. Helicopters circled low above forests and empty fields, while volunteers shouted the siblings' names into the trees. Every hour that passed made the fear worse. At first, many people still believed the children would walk home safely. Maybe they had run away. Maybe they got lost near the highway. Maybe someone picked them up and dropped them somewhere else. But deep down, almost nobody truly believed that anymore. 3 15-year-olds did not simply disappear together without leaving behind a single clear answer, especially not John Brown. Everyone in town knew John would never abandon his sisters willingly. Inside the sheriff's office, Denise Reyes barely moved from the waiting room bench. She still wore the same diner uniform from the night the children vanished. Coffee stains covered one sleeve. Her eyes were swollen from crying, but she refused to go home. Every time the front doors opened, she looked up immediately. Every time a deputy approached, her body tensed. But the updates never changed. Still nothing. Meanwhile, detectives focused on the strange phone number hidden inside John's jacket lining. Investigators believed it was the first real clue in the case. The number led to a roadside motel nearly 40 miles outside town. The place was called the Cedar Grove Inn. But when deputies arrived there, they found something unsettling. The motel had been abandoned for nearly 2 years. The windows were broken. Weeds pushed through cracked pavement. One side of the building had partially collapsed from storm damage. Inside several rooms, old mattresses still sat untouched beneath layers of dust. Yet investigators quickly noticed signs that someone had entered recently. Fresh tire tracks were visible behind the building. Several beer bottles still contained liquid. And inside one room, detectives discovered cigarette smoke lingering faintly in the air. Someone had been there recently, but nobody knew who. The motel owner had disappeared months earlier after falling behind on taxes. Detectives struggled to find records connected to the property. Most of the paperwork seemed incomplete or missing entirely. The mystery only deepened. Back in town, witness reports began flooding into the sheriff's office. Some sounded believable, others sounded impossible. One woman claimed she saw the siblings boarding a bus headed toward Memphis. Another caller insisted the children were kidnapped by a traveling carnival group moving through Tennessee that weekend. Detectives spent hours chasing leads that went nowhere. But then investigators received a tip that genuinely disturbed them. A waitress from a diner outside Jackson contacted police after seeing television coverage of the missing triplets. She claimed she served the siblings breakfast the morning after they disappeared. According to her statement, the 3 teenagers sat quietly inside a booth beside an older white couple. The man did most of the talking. The woman barely spoke at all. The waitress remembered Kristina especially because she seemed frightened. She kept looking at the door. The waitress later told detectives, like she wanted to run. The sighting shook investigators immediately. If the waitress was telling the truth, it meant the siblings survived through the night after vanishing. But there was a problem. The waitress waited nearly 4 days before contacting authorities. By then, the trail was already growing cold. Detectives rushed to the diner, but almost no physical evidence remained. Surveillance cameras were rare in rural Tennessee during the 1980s. No receipts could confirm the visit. All investigators had was the waitress's memory, and memories could be wrong. Still, the possibility changed everything. For the first time, detectives seriously considered the idea that the siblings had been abducted and transported outside the county. Then another witness stepped forward. A truck driver passing through a nearby truck stop told police he heard children arguing inside a parked, dark-colored van around midnight the night the siblings disappeared. He remembered hearing a teenage boy yell something loudly, then silence. The driver admitted he ignored it at the time because arguments between families were common at truck stops. But after seeing the missing posters days later, he began wondering if the voices belonged to the brown triplets. Again, investigators faced the same problem: no license plate, no clear vehicle description, no proof, only another terrifying possibility. As fear spread across western Tennessee, parents stopped allowing children outside alone after dark. Churches began locking doors during evening events. School attendance dropped sharply. The entire town felt different now, quieter, more suspicious. People started watching strangers carefully at gas stations and grocery stores. Rumors spread faster than facts. Some residents whispered that the siblings were targeted intentionally. Others believed somebody local knew more than they admitted. Television crews soon arrived from Nashville and Memphis. Missing posters covered telephone poles across several counties. Reporters interviewed neighbors outside churches while helicopters filmed search teams crossing muddy fields. For a brief moment, the entire state focused on the case. But behind the media attention, detectives quietly uncovered something even more disturbing. Investigators found reports of other missing children connected to highways stretching across Tennessee, Arkansas, and Mississippi during the previous several years. Most cases involved children from poor rural communities. Some disappeared near truck stops. Others vanished near motels or roadside diners. But despite the similarities, investigators could never prove the cases were connected. There was no single suspect, no confirmed vehicle, no fingerprints. Nothing solid enough to build a real theory. And slowly, frustration began destroying the Brown family from the inside. Walter Brown became obsessed with the search. He barely slept anymore. He drove hundreds of miles following random tips from strangers who thought they recognized the siblings. Sometimes he disappeared for entire days without telling anyone where he was going. Denise started blaming herself constantly. Friends later said she replayed one memory over and over again, the moment she let the children walk to the Easter fair alone. One night, she reportedly stood inside Carrie's bedroom for nearly 2 hours, holding one of her daughter's sweaters against her chest. The family was unraveling emotionally. Still, nobody gave up. Then, 6 weeks after the disappearance, another discovery changed the investigation once again. A farmer repairing fencing near railroad tracks outside town noticed something shining beneath loose dirt beside an old utility pole. At first he thought it was trash, but when he pulled it free, he immediately contacted police. The object was a small silver cross necklace. It belonged to Carrie Reyes. Denise recognized it instantly. Carrie wore the necklace almost every day. It had been a gift from her grandfather during her baptism years earlier. Investigators searched the railroad area for days afterward. Dogs tracked scents through nearby woods. Officers dug through muddy ground looking for more evidence. But once again, the search revealed almost nothing. No bodies, no clothing, no clear explanation for how Carrie's necklace ended up buried there. And then the investigation took an even stranger turn. Nearly 2 months after the official search had scaled back, detectives received a call from a woman living outside Nashville. At first, investigators assumed it was another false lead, until the woman said something that made the entire room go silent. She claimed she saw all 3 siblings alive. Days after the police search had already ended. The summer after the triplets disappeared felt endless in western Tennessee. At first, people still searched every day. Neighbors checked empty barns before work. Volunteers drove slowly along back roads, looking into ditches and tree lines. Missing posters covered gas stations, grocery stores, church windows, and telephone poles across 3 counties. But as weeks turned into months, the searches became quieter. The television crews left town. The newspaper headlines became smaller, And eventually, the world moved on. The Brown triplets did not. Inside the small family home outside town, time seemed frozen somewhere in 1984. John's bedroom remained exactly the same for years. His denim boots still sat beside the closet door. A stack of comic books remained untouched beneath his bed. Dust slowly gathered across the room, but nobody moved anything. Carrie's unfinished drawings still covered one bedroom wall. Some were sketches of church buildings and flowers. Others showed the three siblings standing together holding hands beneath large trees. Kristina's cassette tapes stayed stacked beside her radio exactly where she left them the night she vanished. Every Easter weekend, Denise Reyes quietly bought a birthday cake for her children. Even after years passed, even after most people stopped believing the siblings were alive, neighbors later said Denise always bought 3 candles. Never fewer. Walter Brown aged quickly after the disappearance. The strong, quiet grandfather who once repaired fences and worked long hours outside slowly became obsessed with one thing only: finding the children. He drove thousands of miles chasing leads across the South. Sometimes he disappeared for days following rumors from strangers who claimed they saw the triplets at truck stops, diners, or bus stations. Most leads ended the same way: false hope. But Walter never stopped believing somebody somewhere knew the truth. Meanwhile, the investigation slowly collapsed under its own weight. Detectives retired one by one. New officers entering the department barely remembered the case details. Evidence boxes connected to the disappearance were eventually moved into an old county storage room beneath the courthouse. Inside those boxes were hundreds of witness statements, faded photographs, maps, receipts, and handwritten notes from investigators who spent years trying to solve the mystery. None of it brought the children home. Still, strange sightings continued appearing throughout the late 1980s and early 1990s. A truck driver in Arkansas claimed he saw 2 frightened teenage girls traveling with older adults inside a camper near Interstate 40. A motel clerk in Louisiana reported seeing a young black male called Johnny who became terrified whenever police officers entered the building. One waitress insisted the young man looked exactly like John Brown. According to her statement, he refused to make eye contact and kept asking how far away Tennessee was. But by the time detectives followed the lead, the young man was gone. No fingerprints, no records, no proof, only another possibility that refused to disappear. The uncertainty slowly destroyed Denise emotionally. Some mornings she woke up believing her children were still alive somewhere. Other days she convinced herself they were already gone. Friends later described her grief as something unfinished. She never experienced real closure. Her mind stayed trapped between hope and fear for decades. Sometimes she sat for hours replaying old cassette recordings of the children laughing in the background. She became terrified of forgetting their voices. As the years passed, the case slowly faded into local legend. Teenagers growing up in western Tennessee heard stories about the missing triplets like ghost stories told around campfires. Parents warned children not to walk alone near highways after dark, but very few people still believed the case would ever be solved. Then the internet changed everything. In 2006, more than 20 years after the disappearance, a small online missing persons forum unexpectedly reopened public interest in the case. Unlike older investigators, the younger internet users approached the mystery differently. They scanned old newspaper archives, uploaded missing posters, compared timelines, shared maps, analyzed witness statements. For the first time in decades, hundreds of strangers across the country were studying the Brown triplets case together every night online, and slowly they began noticing things investigators had overlooked years earlier. One user enlarged an old evidence photograph taken outside the abandoned Cedar Grove Inn shortly after the disappearance. Most people focused on the police vehicles visible in the image, but one internet user noticed something in the far background: a faded motel sign partially hidden behind trees. The sign belonged to another roadside motel several counties away. Investigators checked old property records and discovered something disturbing almost immediately. That motel had burned down only months after the triplets vanished. The fire was officially ruled accidental. But the timing suddenly seemed impossible to ignore. Online investigators became obsessed with the connection. They began researching the motel owner's history using old newspaper databases and county business records. What they uncovered shocked even veteran detectives. The motel owner, a man named Leonard Griggs, had previously been questioned during an illegal adoption investigation in the early 1980s. The case involved children being moved between states using forged birth certificates and unofficial custody transfers. No charges were ever filed against Griggs. But internet users soon discovered his name appearing in multiple suspicious records connected to missing children cases throughout Tennessee and Arkansas. Suddenly, the old motel no longer looked like a random location connected to the triplets. It looked important, very important. Detectives reopened parts of the investigation quietly. Retired officers were contacted again for interviews. Old witness statements were reviewed for the first time in years, and something deeply unsettling started becoming clear. Several witness sightings from the original investigation pointed toward highways, motels, truck stops, and temporary housing areas stretching across southern states, almost like the children had been moved repeatedly after disappearing. Then investigators uncovered another disturbing detail. Records showed Leonard Griggs vanished shortly after the Cedar Grove Inn fire. No confirmed death certificate existed, no verified address. It was as if the motel owner simply disappeared from public records completely. The mystery grew darker with every discovery. Online users continued posting theories nightly. Some believed the siblings were trafficked separately. Others thought at least one child escaped years earlier under another identity. Then, late one evening, a user from Arizona uploaded a photograph into the forum. At first, almost nobody noticed it. The image showed a woman standing outside a small restaurant beside two children. The post itself seemed ordinary. The user simply claimed the woman looked strangely similar to one of the missing triplets. But within minutes, other users began comparing the photograph to Carrie Reyes's old missing poster from 1984. The same eyes, the same smile, even the shape of her jaw looked identical. The forum exploded with reactions. Some users believed it was coincidence. Others were convinced immediately. The photograph reached Tennessee investigators less than 24 hours later, and when detectives placed the Arizona image beside Carrie's childhood photograph from 1984, the room went completely silent. Because after 22 years, they believed they were finally looking at Carrie Reyes alive. In January of 2007, more than 22 years after the Brown triplets disappeared, two Tennessee detectives stepped off a plane in Phoenix, Arizona, carrying a faded manila folder filled with old photographs. Inside the folder were missing posters from 1984. Pictures of three smiling teenagers who vanished during Easter weekend in western Tennessee. For decades, those photographs had led nowhere, but now, for the first time in years, investigators believed one of the siblings might actually be alive. The woman from the online photograph lived quietly in a suburban neighborhood outside Phoenix. According to public records, her name was Caroline Mitchell. She was 42 years old, married and raising two children. Neighbors described her as kind and reserved. Nobody around her suspected anything unusual, especially not Caroline herself. Detectives watched the house carefully from across the street before making contact. They expected confusion, maybe even fear, but they were not prepared for how emotional the meeting would become. When detectives knocked on the door, Caroline answered holding a grocery bag against her chest. At first, she thought they were asking questions about someone else. Then one detective slowly placed Carrie Reyes's childhood photograph on the table inside her kitchen. Everything changed. Witnesses later said Caroline stared at the photograph for almost a full minute without speaking. Then she whispered one sentence quietly. "That girl looks like me at first." Detectives asked simple questions. Did she know anything about Tennessee? Did she remember living anywhere else as a child? Did she recognize the names John Brown or Kristina Ibarra? Most of the answers were no. Caroline explained she had been raised by an older couple who claimed they rescued her after her biological parents abandoned her as a toddler. According to the story she heard her entire life, she had no surviving relatives. But as detectives continued speaking with her, something strange began happening. Small memories started surfacing. Fragments, tiny disconnected pieces buried deep inside her mind. She remembered church music playing somewhere very far away. She remembered railroad tracks. She remembered standing beside a highway at night holding somebody's hand tightly. And more than anything else, she remembered a boy's voice, a calm voice telling her not to cry. The moment Caroline described the memory, one detective reportedly felt chills run through his body, because John Brown had always been known as the protective sibling, the one who stayed close to his sisters, the one witnesses often described holding their hands while walking through town. Detectives requested DNA testing immediately. The waiting period lasted nearly 3 weeks. During that time, Caroline struggled emotionally in ways her family could barely understand. Friends later said she stopped sleeping normally. She became distant, quiet, almost afraid of her own memories. For 42 years, she believed she understood who she was. Now that identity was collapsing. When the DNA results finally arrived in Tennessee, investigators already suspected the truth, but the confirmation still shocked everyone. Caroline Mitchell was Carrie Reyes. One of the missing Tennessee triplets had been alive the entire time. The news spread across the country within hours. Television stations interrupted broadcasts with updates about the case. Old missing posters from 1984 suddenly appeared everywhere online again. Thousands of people who had never heard of the Brown triplets became obsessed with the mystery overnight. But while the public focused on the emotional reunion, investigators focused on something else. If Carrie survived, what happened to John and Kristina? That question haunted every detective working the case. Meanwhile, Carrie herself struggled to process the truth emotionally. She traveled to Tennessee for the first time since childhood under heavy privacy protection. The moment she stepped into the old family home, witnesses said she immediately recognized the smell of the wooden hallway. Then she began crying uncontrollably. Inside Carrie's old bedroom, many things remained untouched exactly where they had been left in 1984. Her drawings still hung on the wall. Kristina's cassette tape still rested beside the radio, and John's empty bedroom still stood across the hall. Carrie reportedly walked slowly into the room and stared at the bed for several minutes. Then she quietly asked detectives one question nobody could answer. Did he try to save us? The investigation quickly uncovered disturbing new details. Records connected to Carrie's childhood identity appeared deeply suspicious. Her birth certificate had been issued years after her disappearance using forged paperwork. Adoption files contained false addresses and signatures from people who never existed. Investigators soon realized the operation stretched across multiple states. Children had likely been moved through roadside motels, churches, temporary foster homes, and illegal custody arrangements throughout the South during the early 1980s. And somehow Carrie became trapped inside that system for decades. Then Carrie revealed another memory that terrified investigators. As a child, she remembered traveling between motels repeatedly with different adults. Most memories were blurry and fragmented, but one image stayed clear: a young girl crying beside her in the backseat of a car. Carrie could not remember the girl's face completely, but she remembered dark curly hair, and she remembered hearing somebody say the name Kristina. For detectives, the realization was devastating. Kristina may have survived the original abduction too. Suddenly, the possibility of finding another sibling alive became very real. Online communities exploded with activity again. Thousands of internet users helped investigators track down old motel records, abandoned vehicles, newspaper clippings, and missing adoption paperwork connected to the 1980s trafficking network. One retired social worker from Tennessee finally contacted authorities after watching the story on television. For years, she said, she suspected children were being moved illegally through rural counties using fake foster placements and unofficial custody transfers. But every time she raised concerns, supervisors dismissed her claims. Then she mentioned something investigators had never heard before: a hidden property near the Tennessee-Arkansas border connected to several people involved in the trafficking operation. According to the social worker, children were sometimes temporarily housed there before being transferred to other states. Detectives immediately obtained search warrants. The property sat deep in isolated farmland, surrounded by overgrown trees and collapsing fences. Most nearby residents believed it had been abandoned for years. The moment investigators arrived, they realized the place felt wrong. Several structures appeared partially burned. Windows had been nailed shut from the inside. And behind the main house, investigators discovered an area of disturbed earth stretching across part of the backyard. Excavation teams began digging carefully. At first, they uncovered ordinary trash: broken bottles, old clothing, rusting cans. Then investigators found children's toys buried beneath the dirt, dozens of them: tiny shoes, hair ribbons, plastic jewelry, stuffed animals. The discoveries became more disturbing with every shovel pushed into the ground. And then one investigator uncovered something small covered in mud near the edge of the property: a ring. The moment detectives cleaned the dirt away, everyone standing nearby froze, because engraved across the front were two initials: JB. It was John Brown's missing class ring. The discovery of John Brown's class ring changed the entire investigation. For the first time in more than 2 decades, detectives were no longer chasing theories. Now they were standing on property directly connected to the missing triplets. Within days, forensic teams expanded the excavation across the rural Tennessee site. Large floodlights illuminated the property at night, while investigators carefully searched every inch of dirt by hand. What they uncovered shocked even experienced detectives. The property was filled with buried children's belongings: tiny shoes, plastic bracelets, old lunchboxes, pieces of clothing, stuffed animals wrapped in rotting blankets. Many items appeared damaged by water and time, but forensic experts quickly realized something horrifying. The objects did not belong to only one child. Evidence suggested multiple children had passed through the property during the 1980s. Some items came from different states entirely. The investigation suddenly became far bigger than the disappearance of 3 Tennessee teenagers. Meanwhile, Carrie Reyes struggled emotionally as the excavation continued. Each discovery forced buried memories slowly back into her mind. For years, her childhood memories felt broken and incomplete. She remembered sounds more than faces, fear more than details. But now fragments were beginning to connect. One evening, investigators interviewed Carrie inside a quiet hotel conference room near Memphis. Detectives spread old photographs and motel records across a table while asking gentle questions about her earliest memories. At first, Carrie hesitated. Then suddenly, she became very quiet. She stared at one old motel photograph for several seconds before whispering something investigators would never forget. "I remember this room. The motel was located outside Nashville and had been demolished years earlier." Detectives immediately leaned closer as Carrie slowly described flashes of memory returning to her. She remembered sitting on a dirty motel bed beside Kristina. She remembered somebody crying in the bathroom. And she remembered John standing near the door, arguing loudly with a man she could not clearly see. The memory disturbed her deeply because it felt different from the others. Sharper, more real. According to Carrie, John kept telling the man to leave his sisters alone. At one point, she remembered hearing something break against a wall. Then she remembered John yelling at her and Kristina to run. Detectives later compared Carrie's memories against original evidence from 1984. Suddenly, several strange details started making sense. John's denim jacket had been discovered miles away from where the siblings were last seen. At the time, investigators never understood why it appeared abandoned near the drainage ditch without blood or signs of struggle. But forensic reanalysis revealed damage investigators overlooked decades earlier. The jacket's sleeve contained tearing consistent with somebody grabbing it forcefully. There were also faint traces of another person's blood near the cuff, evidence impossible to test properly during the original investigation. Detectives now believed John fought physically against the traffickers during the abduction, and the jacket may have been lost during that struggle. The realization devastated Carrie emotionally. For most of her life, she feared John failed to protect them. Now investigators believed he may have risked everything trying to save his sisters. As the investigation expanded, detectives began tracking former suspects connected to the trafficking network uncovered online. One name appeared repeatedly across motel records, fake adoptions, and abandoned property registrations: a man named Raymond Vickers. But according to official records, Vickers died in 1991. Detectives quickly discovered that was not true. Using old Social Security records and property documents, investigators eventually traced the suspect to a small town in Mississippi where he had lived quietly for years under another name. By then, he was elderly and in poor health. When detectives arrived at the small trailer where he lived alone, neighbors described him as paranoid and withdrawn. Some said he rarely left the property. At first, the suspect denied everything, but after hours of questioning, pieces of the truth slowly began slipping out. He admitted knowing Leonard Griggs. He admitted children were moved through motels across Tennessee during the early 1980s, and eventually, he admitted something even darker. The siblings were separated shortly after Easter weekend in 1984. According to Vickers, traffickers believed keeping the children together created too much risk. John was described as protective and difficult to control. Then the suspect revealed one final detail that shook investigators completely. John allegedly attacked one of the traffickers while trying to help Carrie and Kristina escape from a motel parking lot. The altercation became violent. Afterward, the children were separated permanently. Detectives pressed the suspect for details about what happened next. But Vickers suddenly refused to continue speaking. Still, the interview confirmed investigators' worst fears. The siblings did not vanish randomly. They were trapped inside a trafficking operation that operated across multiple southern states for years. Carrie struggled emotionally after learning what investigators believed happened to John. Friends later said she became overwhelmed with guilt. She reportedly repeated one sentence constantly during interviews: "He tried to save us." Then the case took another devastating turn. In Arkansas, forensic investigators revisited an unidentified remains case discovered years earlier near a wooded highway outside Little Rock. The victim had never been identified. She was believed to be a young black female between the ages of 16 and 20. The case remained unsolved for decades. But after national attention returned to the Brown triplets investigation, Arkansas authorities submitted the unidentified victim's DNA for comparison testing. Several weeks later, Tennessee investigators received the results. The unidentified woman shared partial DNA markers with Carrie Reyes. Detectives believed the victim could be Kristina. The possibility crushed Denise Reyes emotionally. For years, she held on to hope that at least one more child might still come home alive. Now that hope was fading again. Still, investigators remained cautious. The DNA connection was strong, but not yet complete enough for official confirmation. They needed more evidence, more answers, more truth. Meanwhile, detectives returned repeatedly to the Tennessee property searching for additional clues hidden beneath decades of dirt and debris. Late one afternoon, investigators uncovered something unusual beneath loose boards inside an old shed behind the main house, a small metal storage box. The box had been wrapped carefully in plastic before being buried. Inside were dozens of photographs. The moment detectives began sorting through them, the entire investigation changed again, because the photographs showed children, many children, some crying, some standing beside unknown adults. And in several of the images, investigators immediately recognized three terrified teenagers from Tennessee: John Brown, Kristina Ybarra, and Carrie Reyes, alive. Just days after they disappeared, the photographs changed everything. For investigators, they were proof the Brown triplets survived longer than anyone ever imagined. For the family, they were almost impossible to look at. The images recovered from the buried storage box showed John Brown, Kristina Ybarra, and Carrie Reyes alive only days after their disappearance in 1984. Some photographs appeared to be taken outside motels. Others showed the children standing beside unfamiliar vehicles somewhere deep in rural areas investigators could not immediately identify. In almost every picture, the siblings looked frightened. John appeared especially tense. In several photographs, detectives noticed he stood protectively in front of his sisters, as if trying to shield them from the camera itself. One image devastated the family more than all the others. The photograph showed the three siblings sitting together on a motel bed beneath a flickering lamp. Carrie's eyes were swollen from crying. Kristina stared down at the floor. John looked directly into the camera with an expression investigators later described as desperate. It was the first image Carrie had ever seen of herself with her brother and sister since childhood. The moment detectives showed her the photograph, she reportedly broke down completely. For several minutes she could not speak. She simply touched John's face in the photograph over and over again with trembling hands. Then she whispered quietly, "He stayed with us." The investigation exploded nationwide after the photographs became public evidence. Federal agencies joined Tennessee authorities in reconstructing the trafficking operation that moved children through southern states during the late 1970s and 1980s. Investigators uncovered forged birth records, fake church placements, illegal custody transfers, and hidden motel routes stretching across Tennessee, Arkansas, Mississippi, and Louisiana. The deeper detectives looked, the darker the network became. Many children connected to the operation had never been identified. Some were eventually found alive under different names. Others simply disappeared forever. For Denise Reyes, the discoveries brought overwhelming grief mixed with unbearable relief. For years, she blamed herself for allowing her children to walk to the Easter fair alone. Now she understood they were likely targeted long before that night. The realization haunted her deeply. Meanwhile, forensic experts in Arkansas continued working to identify the unidentified remains connected to Kristina Reyes. Advanced DNA testing compared the victim's profile against Carrie and surviving relatives in Tennessee. The results arrived months later. The unidentified Arkansas victim was officially confirmed as Kristina Reyes. She had remained unidentified for decades. Investigators believed Kristina died sometime during the mid-1980s after being moved repeatedly through the trafficking network. The confirmation devastated the remaining family members. Denise reportedly collapsed emotionally inside the medical examiner's office after hearing the news. But even in grief, one question remained unanswered. What happened to John Brown? Detectives believe John resisted the traffickers from the very beginning. Witness statements, Carrie's memories, and evidence recovered from the property all pointed toward the same conclusion. John fought back, and investigators now believed he paid for it. Several clues eventually directed authorities toward wooded railroad land outside Tennessee near the Arkansas border. The location matched descriptions provided years earlier by the elderly suspect, living under another identity in Mississippi. Excavation teams searched the area carefully for days. Then, investigators uncovered human remains buried near an abandoned rail line hidden beneath thick overgrowth. Dental records and DNA testing later confirmed the remains belonged to John Brown. According to forensic investigators, John likely died while attempting to escape custody sometime shortly after the siblings were separated. Detectives believed he may have tried reaching nearby railroad tracks, hoping to find help or transportation. Instead, he disappeared into the woods and was never seen again. When Carrie learned the truth about her brother, she reportedly locked herself inside her hotel room for nearly an entire day. Friends later said she blamed herself for surviving. Again and again, she repeated the same painful question. Why did I make it home and they didn't? But those closest to her reminded her of something investigators already believed. John wanted her to survive. That was the reason he fought. That was the reason he stayed between his sisters and the traffickers in those photographs. And that was likely the reason she lived long enough to eventually come home. In the spring of 2009, more than 25 years after the triplets disappeared, Carrie returned to Western Tennessee permanently for the first time since childhood. The town looked smaller than she remembered. Many buildings had changed. Some roads looked different. But certain places immediately brought memories flooding back. The church still stood near the road where the siblings helped decorate for Easter weekend in 1984. The old highway still stretched past the abandoned gas station. And the drainage ditch where John's jacket was discovered still sat quietly beside the road. That Easter weekend, the town held a memorial service exactly where the siblings were last seen together. Hundreds of people attended. Some were elderly volunteers who helped search for the children in 1984. Others were younger residents who grew up hearing the story their entire lives. Candles lined the church steps as old gospel music played softly in the background. For many people in town, it finally felt like the case was ending. But for the family, the emotions were far more complicated. Walter Brown, now an old man weakened by age and grief, sat quietly in the front row during the memorial service holding one of John's childhood photographs. Witnesses said he barely spoke throughout the ceremony. Then near the end, Carrie walked slowly toward him and held his hand. For a moment, the old man simply stared at her face. After 25 years of searching, one of his grandchildren had finally come home. Walter reportedly began crying so hard he could barely breathe. People nearby later described it as the sound of decades of grief finally breaking apart. The following morning, Carrie visited the roadside ditch where John's jacket had been discovered back in 1984. The road remained almost completely silent except for passing trucks in the distance. She stood there alone for several minutes holding flowers against her chest. Then she gently placed them beside the muddy ground near the ditch. According to investigators standing nearby, Carrie whispered only one sentence. "I never stopped looking for you." For decades, the disappearance of the Brown triplets haunted rural Tennessee like an unfinished nightmare. Families locked doors earlier. Parents feared lonely highways and roadside motels. Entire communities wondered how 3 children could vanish so completely without answers. But in the end, the truth was far worse than most people imagined. Because for 30 years, rural Tennessee believed 3 children vanished into the night. But the truth was hidden inside a trafficking network nobody wanted to see.